Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I'm going to talk about the key danger facing America's future. Shortly after Barack Obama took office, the EPA issued their CO2 endangerment finding. I'll read this description of it from the National Resources Defense Council. In 2009, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency issued its science-based finding that the buildup of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere endangers public health and welfare. The endangerment finding reflects the overwhelming scientific evidence on the causes and impacts of climate change. It was made through a thorough rulemaking process considering thousands of public comments and was upheld by the federal courts. The endangerment finding requires the EPA to take action under the Clean Air Act to curb emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and four other heat-trapping air pollutants from vehicles, power plants, and other industries. So since this rule was passed, carbon dioxide has been classified as a dangerous pollutant. And the EPA has the authority now to shut down people and industries which emit carbon dioxide. Let's look now at who emits carbon dioxide. The burning of fossil fuels emits about 6.3 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide every year. Plant respiration emits about 50 billion tons of CO2, soil respiration emits about 60 billion, and the oceans emit about 90 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year. If you add it all up, fossil fuel burning is less than 5% of annual CO2 emissions. So if the EPA wanted to go after the really big emitters of carbon dioxide, that would be plants, soils, and the ocean. It's interesting that carbon dioxide is considered a pollutant, considering that it's the basis of all life on Earth. The process of plant growth requires sunlight, carbon dioxide, chlorophyll, and water. Green plants consist of compounds which were formed from carbon dioxide and water molecules. These combine with chlorophyll, which is the chemical which makes plants green, and sunlight to produce oxygen and plant growth. Life can't exist without carbon dioxide, and commercial greenhouse operators pump carbon dioxide into their greenhouses to make the plants grow faster. If CO2 was a pollutant, commercial greenhouse operators would obviously not be pumping it into the air around their plants. The whole concept of carbon dioxide being a pollutant under the Clean Air Act is absurd. I fought hard for the Clean Air Act and never thought it would be abused like this. Now let's look at some of the junk science and propaganda surrounding carbon dioxide folklore. These are typical photographs reported by the press when they're doing articles about carbon dioxide. Cutting carbon emissions, carbon pollution, carbon emissions, carbon pollution. They all show visible emissions from smokestacks, but carbon dioxide is invisible. And as a result of all this bad reporting, propaganda, and misinformation, Greta Thunberg believes that she can see carbon dioxide. But carbon dioxide is a colorless, odorless trace gas which is essential for life on Earth. It's unfortunate that the UN's climate expert has such a fundamental misunderstanding of the properties of carbon dioxide. But not at all surprising given that journalists and many politicians share the same misconceptions. Greta Thunberg gave an angry speech at the UN yesterday, accusing adults of stealing her dreams. I completely agree with her. It's just not the adults who she thinks it is. I'll be talking about that at the end of the video. When Greta Thunberg and everybody else exhales, they emit about 40,000 parts per million carbon dioxide out of their mouth. The purpose of human lungs is to combine oxygen from the air and carbon compounds in our bloodstream. This burning process produces energy which powers our body, and the byproduct is that carbon dioxide emissions are exhaled out of our mouth and nose. If carbon dioxide was visible, as many people on the left believe, there would be a big cloud visible coming out of her mouth. Obviously, that's not the case. According to the United Nations forecast from 1989, yesterday's speech should have been impossible anyway. The world should have been destroyed before Greta was born. June 30th, 1989, grim forecast. A senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. Coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of eco-refugees, threatening political chaos, said Brown, director of the New York office of the UN Environment Program. This all would have happened a few years before Greta was born. And Greta couldn't have given her speech on the same date in 1938 because New York and New England were facing a massive hurricane. New York Times, Friday, September 23, 1938. Storm toll 462, thousands homeless, 250 killed in the Providence area. New England still battles floods. And this is what Providence, Rhode Island looked like that day. The 1938 hurricane was the worst hurricane that's hit New York in the past century, and carbon dioxide levels were below 310 parts per million at the time. I'm going to guess that none of the adults around Greta told her about the 1938 hurricane. Now let's talk about the history of how many people came to be afraid of carbon dioxide. In the late 19th century, a Swedish scientist named Svante Arrhenius came up with a theory that carbon dioxide emissions were going to produce a huge amount of warming. I'm going to read this article from January 1913, The Coming Exodus to Siberian Canada. One of the greatest scientists in the world is Arrhenius of Sweden. He's a chemist and physicist and has studied this matter. He shows that this proportion of carbon dioxide in the air will make the climate warmer by acting like the glass roof of a greenhouse. With the carbon dioxide increased from 2½ to 3 times, the temperature of the whole world will be raised 8 to 9 degrees centigrade, and Greenland will have a good climate for farming. All the good soil of Canada will be as temperate as a climate is now enjoyed by Missouri. Corn will be grown in the Peace River Valley. Oranges will be an orchard fruit in Arkansas and Virginia. The suburban residents of Chicago may literally sit under their own fig trees and grape arbors. Cotton will be a stable crop in Iowa. Bananas will fringe the shores of the Gulf. Siberia will become the greatest farming country in the world. The great Antarctic continent, one of the greatest on Earth in extent, will be the Western Canada, the Scandinavia, the Siberia of that day, and will have millions of people. Alaska will be as warm as Maine now is, and the heat of all the tropics will be made hotter for thousands of years. The increased heat will cause more evaporation of water vapor from the oceans. As what goes up must come down, this will cause moister climates almost everywhere, and our dry farming sections will become as wet as Ohio. And then the passengers on this good ship Earth will have vast fields of good land, which are not good now, upon which to multiply, as it seems to be their fate to do. All this will take place in a time shorter than the history of England since the Norman Conquest, in twice the time which has elapsed since the governor's palace was built in Santa Fe, New Mexico, our youngest state. So there's two interesting things to notice here. One is that they thought global warming was going to be a good thing, and two, Arrhenius had no idea what he was talking about. Siberia is not showing any signs of becoming a great farming country. Arrhenius was also a big proponent of solar energy and said in 1925 that the world would run out of oil within a generation. Arrhenius also believed that children's development could be enhanced by passing electricity through them, and he did experiments in public schools in Stockholm, Sweden, which might explain some of Greta's learning disabilities. In 1901, Knut Angstrom explained the problems with Arrhenius's theories about carbon dioxide. Angstrom did an experiment where he showed that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere already absorbed just about all of the available radiation, which meant that adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere would have very little effect on Earth's radiative balance. And Angstrom explained what Arrhenius did wrong. Arrhenius failed to account for water vapor as a greenhouse gas. Water vapor is a much stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and it's much more abundant in the atmosphere. Arrhenius attributed the entire greenhouse effect to carbon dioxide, when in fact it's only a minor component. The primary greenhouse gas is water vapor. So Arrhenius' mistake has led to decades of superstition and ultimately to the CO2 endangerment finding of the EPA. In 1941, the United States Department of Agriculture confirmed Angstrom's experiment. Much has been written about varying amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as a possible cause of glacial periods. The theory received a fatal blow when it was realized that carbon dioxide is very selective as to the wavelengths of radiant energy it will absorb, filtering out only such waves as even very minute quantities of water vapor dispose of anyway. No probable increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide can materially affect either the amount of insulation reaching the surface or the amount of terrestrial radiation lost to space. So once again, they're saying that the carbon dioxide spectra is already saturated and that adding more carbon dioxide will make very little difference. In 1971, the top experts from NASA and the National Center for Atmospheric Research confirmed Angstrom's experiment again. Their paper was titled Atmospheric Carbon Dioxide and Aerosols, Effects of Large Increases on Global Climate. The main conclusion of this part of the study is that even an order of magnitude increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by human activities, which at the present rate of input is not expected within the next several thousand years, may not be sufficient to produce a runaway greenhouse effect on Earth. Scientists have known for a long time that Arrhenius's predictions were wildly exaggerated, yet we still have the CO2 endangerment finding hanging over our heads. Let's talk now about what we do know about climate. This is from the same 1941 USDA article I was discussing earlier. It will be news to many people that man, during his geologically brief existence on Earth, has never known a normal climate. We're now at the tail end of an ice age and living in a period of crustal and climatic violence as great as any the Earth has ever known. This is why we have to think so much about the weather. Such periods of revolution have occurred briefly several times in the history of the Earth. Between them have been the far longer periods of crustal peace and a genial climatic uniformity, the normal times of the geologist. So what the article is saying is that we live in an unusual period of extreme weather, and it has nothing to do with carbon dioxide, as they explained later in the article. One of my degrees is in geology, and I spent a lot of time working as a geologist. And one of the things geologists have to know about is Earth's climate history. This chart is also from the 1941 U.S. Department of Agriculture paper, and it shows the development of life over geologic time on Earth. If we go back 600 million years in time and start moving towards the present, we see abundant life in the seas, oldest known fishes, oldest land plants and animals, amphibians and forests on lands, amphibians dominant on land. And then if we look at the chart on the right, we can see what atmospheric CO2 levels and Earth's temperature was at the time all these things were occurring. Atmospheric CO2 levels are shown as the black line, and you can see they were very high back then, about 7,000 parts per million, more than 10 times higher than they are now. This information alone is enough to tell us that climate alarmism is based on complete nonsense. Life thrived on Earth when CO2 levels were 10 to 20 times higher than they are now. Corals evolved, shellfish evolved. Obviously, ocean acidification was not a problem when CO2 levels were much higher. Corals thrived at high CO2 levels and high temperatures. Temperatures were more than 10°C warmer than they are now. During periods of Earth warming, the tropics expand. Corals like warm water, so their range expands. They move to higher latitudes. Every serious geologist knows that the climate crisis is complete nonsense. And Michael Mann is not an exception to this rule because he's not a serious scientist. This is what Earth looked like at high CO2 levels. Life thrived. The whole idea of an extinction rebellion is based on mass superstition and hysteria. It has nothing to do with science. We know from looking at Earth's past that life does very well at high CO2 levels, which is the reason why greenhouse operators pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere of their greenhouse. They want the plants to grow faster. We also know from history what the climate was like at lower CO2 levels. Let's take a look at that next. These graphs from the National Climate Assessment show that heat waves were much worse in the United States when CO2 levels were much lower. Heat waves peaked in the U.S. during the 1930s and have been generally declining ever since. And it's important to realize that the United States has by far the best temperature records in the world. This is what the Midwest looked like in the 1930s when carbon dioxide levels were about 310 parts per million. It wasn't a pretty sight. Now let's go back even further. The history of the world's droughts goes back to the year 627, when in France and Germany thousands of human beings died of thirst. In the year 1000, the rivers of Europe dried up, and heaps of fish were left to putrefy and spread the plague that followed. In 1123, the Rhine River dried up in Alsace. During the Battle of Bella in 1260, more men died from heat than wounds. In 1303 and 1304, the Rhine, the Loire, and Seine rivers ran dry. In 1779, many persons in Bologna were stifled. Shops all over Europe were closed for months. In 1821, a plague of mice came with intolerable heat. More than 200,000 persons died from heat in France. Greta has obviously been lied to by the adults around her. Lower CO2 levels do not produce a good climate. History shows us that unequivocally. Now let's look at fires. The worst fires in U.S. history occurred in 1871. This was the Chicago fire when the whole city burned down. And on the same day in 1871 as the Chicago fire, massive fires broke out all around the Great Lakes. Peshtigo, Wisconsin was completely wiped out and more than 1,000 people died. Forest fire burn acreage in the United States is down about 80% since the 1930s. What about tornadoes? The worst tornado in U.S. history occurred in 1925. It covered several states and destroyed dozens of towns. More than 1,000 people were killed and 3,000 people injured. And what about tropical storms? These charts show the 10 deadliest Pacific typhoons and the 10 deadliest Atlantic hurricanes. All but 2 occurred with carbon dioxide levels below 350 parts per million, which is what climate alarmists claim is the safe point. It's interesting to note how many of them occurred around the time of the U.S. Revolutionary War. The deadliest Atlantic hurricane occurred in 1780, which was also the year of the 3rd deadliest Pacific typhoon. The 6th deadliest Atlantic hurricane occurred in 1776, and the 8th occurred in 1775. So apparently emissions from George Washington's sport utility horse were responsible. This is what Providence, Rhode Island looked like during the hurricane of 1815. Rhode Island Senator Whitehouse believes that he can stop hurricanes through a carbon tax, but history tells us otherwise. This week in 1926, Miami was destroyed by a massive Category 4 hurricane. It was the most expensive natural disaster in U.S. history, inflation adjusted. The Red Cross rated 1927 as the worst year in their history and reported 111 disasters, including the worst flooding on record in the United States along the Mississippi River. Vermont also had their worst flooding in 1927 along the Winooski River. 1,000 bridges were wiped out and the lieutenant governor drowned. St. Louis was largely destroyed by a tornado in 1927. We've been very lucky in recent years that we haven't suffered catastrophes on the scale of 1927. The deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history occurred in Galveston, Texas in the year 1900. A 15-foot storm surge wiped out almost the entire city and killed 10,000 people. Darwin, Australia was completely destroyed by Cyclone Tracy on Christmas Day 1974. The city had to be abandoned for about a year. The deadliest natural disaster in world history occurred in China in 1931. A massive flood drowned 3 million people and left tens of millions of people homeless. One of the favorite claims of climate alarmists is that global warming leads to extreme rainfall. But if we look at the rainfall records for the United States and the world, we see little evidence to support that idea. In 1956, 1.2 inches of rain fell at Unionville, Maryland in 1 minute. In 1960, 2 inches of rain fell in 5 minutes at Alamogordo Creek, New Mexico. In 1881, 2.3 inches of rain fell in 12 minutes at Embarrass, Wisconsin. In 1871, almost 4 inches of rain fell in 15 minutes at Galveston, Texas. In 1935, Woodward Ranch, Texas set the world record rainfall of 22 inches of rain in 2 hours and 45 minutes. and in 1942, Smethport, Pennsylvania, in 3 hours had 28.5 inches of rain. That's just unbelievable. And a few hours before the 1935 rainfall at Woodward Ranch, Texas, a nearly as large storm hit eastern Colorado, which caused massive flooding on the Republican River in Nebraska, which killed 250 people. 1936 brought the worst heat waves in U.S. history. It also brought some of the largest floods on March 21st. This is what Pittsburgh looked like on the day when my grandfather had to be evacuated from downtown Pittsburgh by boat. And here was the headline, "All Eastern America Under Floodwaters." I guess Greta couldn't have given her speech that day. Greta has been under the influence of a climate predator named Kevin Anderson, who's been scaring her for political purposes. So now let's discuss what's wrong with the CO2 endangerment finding. We know from history that life thrived at high CO2 levels. We see no indication in the historical record that there was a problem with ocean acidification. And we can also see from the historical record that there's no reason to believe that lower CO2 levels would mean less extreme weather. The endangerment finding is based on superstition, not science. But what the endangerment finding does do is it provides the legal basis for climate alarmists to shut down the U.S. energy supply, which we all depend on for our day-to-day survival. Imagine what would happen if anti-fracking activists were successful and people drove to the gas station and they couldn't buy gasoline. Mass chaos would ensue. We all depend on having electricity or natural gas during the winter when it's very cold outside. Without it, millions of people would freeze to death. Our food supply, our transportation, our communications, our internet, our computers, everything depends on a reliable 24/7 source of power. We can't afford to have our hospital operating room shut down because the wind isn't blowing that day or because it's dark out. Children today are used to having everything they need always available to them, and they have absolutely no concept of what it's like to live without them. Even having a weak phone signal is a disaster for many young people. My other degree is in electrical engineering. No serious engineer believes that we can go 100% renewable. It's just not realistic. The wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, and there's huge environmental impacts involved with both the solar and the wind industry, which climate alarmists don't want to talk about. The 100% renewable target is nothing more than nonsense being propagated by politicians. Bernie Sanders wants a $14 trillion program to solve a problem which doesn't even exist. That would be about $100,000 per family devoted to nothing but superstition. If climate alarmists are successful at shutting down the fossil fuel supply via the CO2 endangerment finding, it would be the biggest disaster in U.S. history. They must be stopped. Every serious-minded American needs to be in touch with their politicians and tell them to revisit the CO2 endangerment finding. I have no ties to the fossil fuel industry, and as a lifelong environmentalist and a cyclist, I would love to see 90% of the cars off the road, but shutting down the fossil fuel supply is simply insane. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.